What's up, everybody? Eric Messersmith here for Everybody Settle Down, and I wanted to do a video on the big, beautiful bill passing in the House of Representatives. This is not the final chapter by any means. Now it will go to the Senate. They're going to change it in a bunch of ways, most likely, then send it back to the House. And the House will have to vote again to approve that version. So there's still a long way to go here, but this was a huge step and a huge win for the president and for the Speaker, Mike Johnson, because a few days ago it looked like they would be sunk. There were moderates who said they would vote against it because it didn't include enough state and local tax deductions for representatives from places like New York and California. There were conservatives who said they were going to vote against it because it didn't reduce the deficit enough. But in the end, Trump went to the Capitol on Tuesday morning, spoke to the entire conference. They continued to talk and twist arms over the next day and a half or so. And then finally, they were able to pass it 215 to 214 by one vote. It made it through the House of Representatives. So now it goes to the Senate. Senators on the Republican side, it seems like, have a bunch of things they'd like to change. So we'll see. There's still a long way to go on this. But at least you have kind of an outline. And look, this is probably going to be not just the biggest bill that passes during this Trump administration, but it might be the only really big bill that passes. Historically, Trump has done a lot in terms of executive orders over the first few months, more than any modern president, but he's also signed fewer bills into law than any modern president. The number I saw the other day was only five pieces of legislation so far, none of them major. So a lot of the stuff he's doing through executive action, you may agree or disagree, but it could be easily reversed by the next president if it's a Democrat. But if you get legislation passed, of course, then it's much harder. And look, this does a lot of things. The House big beautiful bill that passed, the House version, it makes the tax cuts from 2017 permanent. It adds for a few years no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. Those eventually phase out, but at least initially that's Trump keeping his campaign promise. It also phases out a lot of the clean energy tax credits that are funding projects all over the country with wind, solar, nuclear, that were passed during the Biden administration in the Inflation Reduction Act. It phases those out. And in the House version, it phases them out really quickly. Like, they have to be started within 6 months after the bill passes, or there could be real trouble. They could be phased out, and the projects have to be implemented by 2028. That's a problem for a lot of Republicans. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So it cuts taxes, it phases out clean energy, and it also is going to cause people to lose health insurance through reductions in subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, and also through changes to Medicaid, work requirements primarily, but there's some other changes as well. Now, look, here's my problem with this bill. Some of the things in here I like, a lot I don't. But the Yale Budget Lab estimates this will add $3.4 trillion to our national debt over the next 10 years. And already our debt's projected to go up roughly $20 trillion over the next 10 years before this. So this is another $3.4 trillion on top of that. And remember, we're at $36 trillion now. You see, our debt is finally starting to become an issue. We've had high debt levels for a long time, but we had low interest rates, and so government kept spending. We had emergencies like the financial crisis in 2008, COVID, and so we just kept spending money. We never really, Democrats and Republicans, never got together to work out a deal. Neither party ever really did anything substantive about it when they controlled the House, Senate, and the White House. And so here we are. Moody's downgraded us. They were the last major credit agency that had us with a perfect credit rating. They downgraded that the other day. Bonds, the yield on bonds has risen substantially in the last couple of weeks. A lot of people think that's because it's getting harder for the U.S. to sell its treasury bonds, because people are beginning to think we might not be a safe bet long term. And the reason is because of this, because of the massive debt. And this bill, at the end of the day, would add a substantial amount of money to the debt. Now, Republicans say it's not going to actually be $3.5 trillion because the tax cuts will cause economic activity that will make up some of that. So really, it's going to be a lot less, but they're still not saying that it's going to actually balance, because they know that it's not. As written, this bill is going to add trillions of dollars to our debt. And most of the tax cuts are going to go to the very wealthy. In fact, $1.1 trillion of tax cuts over the next 10 years in this bill go to people making $500,000 or more. Look, we just can't afford to be giving tax cuts to very wealthy people with a $36 trillion debt. I'm all for cutting spending. I'm all for reducing some of the waste, fraud, and abuse, as Trump likes to point out. But I think we've seen with Doge, so far the numbers of what they're cutting, they've had a lot of activity, they've done a lot of things, but the overall number isn't substantial. It isn't, at least so far, reducing the long-term debt trend lines we have in our country. The solution is, yes, we have to cut spending, but we also have to raise taxes on the very wealthy. There were reports Trump actually suggested that to Mike Johnson and to the leadership in the House. Let the tax cuts expire for people making more than, say, $500,000 or $1 million a year, and then keep the tax cuts permanent for everybody else. I think that would have been a much better bill. It would have saved a lot of money over time, but of course the Republicans in the House didn't go for it. So the very wealthy are going to get their tax cuts. If you look at the way they've broken down this bill, when you look at everything together, the benefit reductions, the tax cuts, the bottom 10% is expected to lose in this in terms of their total household wealth, and the top 10% in the country is going to make huge advances. And not only that, the clean energy tax credits, the New York Times had this stat the other day. We've spent about $300 billion around the country building solar, wind, nuclear projects. Some of those projects are done. Some of them have just started. Some of them are in the middle of construction. But there's another $500 billion pending from the Inflation Reduction Act. And much of that, the vast majority, well over 50%, is in Republican congressional districts. It's in red states and red districts where these projects are, by and large, being built. These solar farms, wind farms, nuclear facilities, the clean energy we need. That's the new part of the new economy. Solar panels, clean energy. Trying to reduce fossil fuel production and use what has now become pretty cheap energy through especially solar and wind. And this bill would phase these projects out really quickly. In fact, a lot of these projects would essentially have to be scrapped. And I just don't think a lot of these Republicans in the Senate from some of these states, particularly if they're in a swing state, like say Tom Tillis, he's a Republican senator from North Carolina up for re-election next year. I just don't think they're going to go for that. I think they will push to have these phase out much more gradually so that a lot of these projects can get built. And I think that's the right way to go. So we'll see how it all goes. Hopefully, this is some version of this is going to pass. The president and the Republicans in Congress have too much riding on it not to pass, and they're not going to let all the tax rates expire at the end of this year, which would essentially mean a tax increase for everybody. That's what would happen if they do nothing. And so something will pass, some version of this bill. I just hope in the Senate they can make it a little bit better, make it a little bit less of an impact on the debt, make sure that nobody's kicked off Medicaid who really, really needs it. Work requirements are okay, but beyond that, I think it would be a mistake. Some of the Medicaid provisions are going to lead to people losing their coverage. I think that would be bad. And then the clean energy credits, hopefully they can do something there. So I think the best case scenario is that the Senate can make this better, but some version of this is going to pass, and it's almost certainly going to add to what is already our massive $36+ trillion debt. All right, that's all for now. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We'll be back with more content in the coming weeks ahead. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day.